Hello everyone, welcome to Insights Alley. In this series about startup basics, we will try to understand and learn from insights shared by various phenomenal people around startups, product, growth, sales, strategy, and everything in between. My name is Arun Verma, and let's get started. In today's episode, we will talk to Patrick Campbell, who is the co-founder and CEO of ProfitWell. Patrick is the resident go-to expert when it comes to pricing for subscription businesses. We will be talking about how founders should think about pricing strategy for their B2B or B2C SaaS startup. So here is the episode. Hello Patrick, welcome to Insights Alley, and thanks a lot for taking out some time for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So Patrick, would you like to start with telling us your story in brief, from your early career to Price Intelligently, then ProfitWell, and what are you doing these days?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know how brief it's going to be, but I'll try to keep it short. So
Sure.
I'm originally from Wisconsin, which is kind of in the middle of the United States. Grew up basically in dairy country, meaning with a lot of cows. Grew up in a town with more cows than people, and basically come from a blue collar family. And I went to school, university in Illinois. Also in a pretty country area. I studied econometrics and math, and then ended up going to work in the US Intel community and Google. And so at both places, I was doing something called econ modeling, which is just a fancy way of saying taking a bunch of inputs, data, applying some formulas and things like that to it to try to get something out of it. So when I was at the in the Intel community, doing that to hunt bad guys and gals, and at Google using that to kind of hunt money in kind of a sales operations kind of capacity. And so and then I worked at another company, or I at both places I ended up getting pretty frustrated with the bureaucracy of the organization. So the large, government obviously is very bureaucratic. And then Google, it's very large. So it also is pretty bureaucratic.
Right.
And ended up basically jumping out and working at a smaller company, about 60 people in Boston here, called Gemvara. And that was for those in the States, or I think they're international, it's a Blue Nile competitor. So it's like customizable jewelry.
Okay.
And then based on that, what ended up happening is, got the bite to do pricing. And so worked on pricing there for one of the projects that I worked on. And that's where I discovered that pricing is something that's super, super important, but we don't really know a lot about it.
Right.
So started Price Intelligently with a couple of co-founders, and I was the only one that was full time, and then started kind of attacking this whole concept of subscription growth and really trying to unpack like what is the unified theory of subscription growth? Like how can I basically understand the best way to grow a subscription business? Like where is that source of truth? And that led us to building ProfitWell because we knew we needed, more data to provide insights and information about what was going on with a particular company. And from there, just kept the ball rolling, and we started ProfitWell. And ProfitWell's free subscription financial metrics. So you plug in your billing systems, Zora, Braintree, Stripe, whatever you're using, and you get free access to your MRR and your churn stats and all that kind of fun stuff. And
Right.
then we build tools. The way we make money is we basically build tools that help you make money through churn and pricing and things of that sort. And our big differentiator is, we're the only one on the market that's 100% accurate for the metrics.
Mhm.
And that allows us to just be really good. And so that's caused us to essentially, kind of roll through in terms of, our business. And now we have about 25% of the entire subscription market using one or more of our products.
Oh, wow.
So it's good scaling. So that's kind of the rambly, but maybe not as brief as you wanted version of where we are.
It's okay. So I'll start with a very trivial question, but I want to know your thoughts on the importance of having a pricing strategy in the first place. So when you should be thinking about pricing, in what stage of your startup or product development, in both B2B and B2C SaaS startups, because I think in B2B, you definitely want to start charging for your product from the very beginning. But what about B2C SaaS startups? So eager to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that when you're starting out, there's two types of companies. There's a company who is a very exceptional company when it comes to growth. And then there's companies that are basically everyone else. And when I say companies that are exceptional when it comes to growth, I'm talking about in particular companies that have someone or a group of people on their team who are extremely good at acquisition. So I think of a company called Loom. Loom basically focuses on, it's kind of attacking the communication and kind of screen sharing space and video space a little bit as well.
Right.
This is a company where their team is very, very good at acquiring users and potential customers. Most of us think that we're really, really good at that, or that we can be really good at that. And in reality, we're not. In reality, we do not have, a upper quartile or a top 5% person on our team. And we ourselves aren't that person. And it doesn't mean we're bad at that. It just means we're not amazing. So for most of us, if we're starting a consumer business or we're starting a B2B business, we have to get good at acquisition, but we also need to understand where our pricing is going to trend. So if I'm starting a B2C business or a direct-to-consumer business, I very well may be absolutely okay with not understanding what my pricing is going to look like, because there's some reasons that you might not charge out of the gate. But when you're going to go out and acquire a bunch of different types of leads or customers or potential customers, you should know who you're going to go after. And the only way you know who you're going to go after is if you have some semblance of an understanding of what your pricing should look like or what your pricing is going to look like. So that's why I think that all companies should have some sort of a pricing strategy. And it's probably a broader, definition of something like a monetization strategy.
Right.
It just might not mean that you're executing on it. It means that you might just be doing, the research to understand where you're going to go.
Right. So, how should founders think about pricing in terms of, let's say, providing a free trial or having a freemium acquisition method and then trying to make those users pay? What would you suggest founders for both B2B and B2C on how should they figure around this thing when they are in early stage?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the data suggests that in the early stage, you shouldn't do a free plan.
Okay.
You might have a free trial, but you shouldn't do a freemium model. And the reason is because it go back to what I'm just talking about. Now, if you have someone who is amazing at acquisition,
right,
then you might be able to have a free plan in the early days. But the most successful, and the data shows the most successful freemium plans are typically those of companies that didn't have a freemium plan until 3 to 4 years into the business.
okay.
And so that just kind of supports and shows, exactly what's going on in the greater business, where if you don't understand your customer, you don't understand who they are, what they want, what they need, et cetera, it doesn't matter if you have a free plan and you're acquiring your users, because all of a sudden you're going to be acquiring the wrong users, and then you're going to try and go get them to pay. And the problem is that you're probably not going to be able to get them to pay what you think you should, because you didn't do your research up front. You didn't think about kind of that monetizable path. Now, there's of course like gradients here, right? So I might not go crazy in terms of that research early on, because there's other research in the market that I'm looking at to kind of grow my business. But it's super important to kind of think about that in terms of context.
Right. How about examples like some B2C examples like Trello, or even I think Loom, Dropbox? Don't you think that they started with a freemium acquisition method very early on in the game?
Yeah, but you're proving my point, because all three of those companies have amazing teams that are that good at acquisition, right?
Right.
So Dropbox, they were one of the first people to use freemium in B2B. And they were the ones who basically invented the viral loop for user referrals, right?
All
you look at Loom.
Growth hacking works and all these things. Right.
Totally, right? Like they had world-class people at that, right? Loom right now, I mean, it's TBD how successful that company becomes, but they are extremely successful right now at acquiring users. I think they haven't really focused on monetization too much yet.
Right.
But it is one of those things where, it's a little bit TBD. And so that's where, and even Trello was really, really good at acquiring users. And then all of a sudden, and Trello is actually a really good example. When it came time to monetize those users, they ran into a lot of trouble, because it was, we acquired just a bunch of different types of people, but the engineers are the ones who are the only ones who are really willing to pay. And all of a sudden we're running into trouble because they want things that we don't want to build because it will alienate my other free users. And this is why I talk so much like freemium is not a revenue model. Freemium is acquisition model. You have to think about freemium like a premium ebook. That's more of how you should think about it. Those are leads that then can be monetized in some particular way. But again, if you don't understand who your customer is, who you're going to sell to, it's not great to acquire a bunch of users that aren't ever going to pay you. You're just wasting a bunch of time and resources.
Wow, that's a good way to look at it. So what type of pricing strategies are there and which ones are the best for which kind of scenarios? So I was looking at your ProfitWell videos also, where you were explaining different strategies like cost plus markup, then competitive benchmarking, and then value metric based pricing, which you've been championing for very long. Could you explain these and perhaps with a few examples?
Yeah, totally. So you have cost plus pricing, which is kind of like what it sounds like.
Right.
You take your costs and you slap kind of an arbitrary margin on top of it. And the big problem with cost plus pricing is that your customers, they don't care about your costs, they care about their costs, right? And so if you're pricing based on your costs, it's kind of like there's no context for that customer. There's also competitive based pricing, which obviously is taking your competitors and taking in mind and then pricing either above them, below them, or similar to them. The problem here is that you're assuming that you're selling basically the same product to the exact same type of customer. And that's probably not the case, even in very competitive markets. I know you had John from Nimble on here. Nimble is not selling to the same company that is looking at Salesforce. There might be some crossover, but there's not going to be an immense amount of crossover. And then the other thing with competitive-based pricing is you're also assuming that your competitors have done their homework. You're assuming that they have researched the market enough and researched their customers enough to get their pricing right. And essentially all data indicates that they absolutely have not been able to do that. And so it's one of those things where the big, focus should be on value-based pricing, which is pricing based on the value that your customer sees. And what you should be doing is collecting data. And there's a whole myriad of ways that you can collect data, both qualitatively and quantitatively, around where your customers see value and the level to which they see value. And then what you do is you take that value-based pricing data and then you compare it to your costs as well as your competitors, because those are good inputs, but they're very secondary or tertiary, your costs and your competitors. And so if you find out that your value-based price, the willingness to pay is $10, but your cost is $10, now you're not going to sit there and go, oh, well, they just don't see the value. We're going to go price it at $10 still, or we're going to price it at the $25, because you're just going to alienate the people that you think you should be targeting. When you have a situation where the willingness to pay is $10 and your costs are $10, you either need to fix the product in order to boost value, in order to basically, get that willingness to pay to be higher, or you need to find a different type of customer who actually values that product at a much higher rate than the $10. You could also affect your costs, meaning get more efficiency. But in the world of kind of software and technology, most of the time, the relative value that you're providing a particular customer should far outweigh your cost, just because there's efficiency with, obviously the cloud and things like that.
Even if we dig deeper into the value metric based pricing, how do you define or find that value? Because there are so many variables and dimension for value metric also. So by different variables, I mean, it could be number of users or number of seats. Then another variable could be frequency of the product usage. Then it could be number of features. How to think around this?
Yeah, this is a really good concept. It's known as the value metric. And the reason it's so great is because we're now able to measure value like we weren't able to do 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, there were just a lot of technological barriers to measuring, the actual value that you're bringing a customer, or to measure some element of usage. But now it's easier to do that, and it'll get easier over time because we'll be able to measure more things and integrate with other things and all kinds of fun stuff. And so your value metric, it's one of the most important pieces. And in order to kind of get it right, a good proxy to kind of think about is, what is the actual value of what you're providing? And it's probably some element of you're either saving someone costs, you're increasing the amount of revenue they get, you're saving them time, which is basically like, saving them money,
Right.
or some element of that. And then think about what is the perfect value metric. So if I'm a CRM, my perfect value metric is the amount of money I bring you because of the efficiency of, using the product.
Right.
Now, I can't measure that perfectly. And even if I was able to measure it, you would say, well, I'm the one who closed the deal. You just helped me. But was that help 10% of the deal? Was it 100% of the deal? Like, it's hard to kind of litigate that. And so when you have that perfect value metric, if you can't measure it as well as you should, or there's a dissonance in terms of the customer doesn't quite see that that's the amount of value that you provided, then you want to take like one step back. So in a CRM case, one step back is either, number of contacts, number of reps, sales reps that are there,
Right.
or, something in between. And when you have that step back, there's probably only about 3 to 5 options that really make sense. And then you can use some of the methodologies that we've talked about to basically test those particular things. And so, yeah, long story short, I think that's what's so powerful about, what's happening in the world of kind of subscriptions and the world of technology, because we can now measure all of these things in a proper way.
Makes sense. So let's say we are just getting started with charging for our product. So as you mentioned earlier also, you see what the value metric could be, and then you compare it with your cost and even competitors also. But still, how do we find that initial price point? Means whether it's going to be $9.99 a month or $14.99, $49.99. I mean, it's kind of difficult to assume for the very first time. And I'm not even sure we should even just assume that, because we are trying to find out the price on the value that our product is creating for our user, right? So how do we find that initial exact price point?
So in terms of the actual price point, so it really comes down to, you got to know your buyers, you got to know a bunch of different things that, we talk about all the time. But in terms of the actual price point, we can take advantage of the way that human beings think about value.
Mm-hmm.
So we think about value on a spectrum. So what I mean by that is, and psychologists, economists, they've been studying this for decades, and so it's one of those things where there's a lot of science behind this, and I'm not necessarily the best arbiter of all that science, but what the basic concept comes down to is that we know, for example, that the computer that you might be listening to this on, or the phone you might be listening to this on, is worth more than the bottle of water that might be on the table next to us.
Right.
That's something that we just inherently know because we've either purchased water in the past, we've purchased a computer in the past, we get more value out of the computer versus the water. Now, if I put you in the middle of the desert and don't give you any water for 3 days, all of a sudden that value shifts. That spectrum, it shifts in terms of where the value is, because we're going to want that water above everything else. And so we can take advantage of this phenomenon by essentially asking in ranged questions. Now, there's a few other ways you can do this. We've just found this to be one of the most successful ways. So I can ask you, at what particular price point is this way too expensive that you would never consider purchasing it? At what particular price point is it getting expensive, but you'd still consider purchasing it? At what point is it a really good deal? And at what point is it too cheap that you'd question the quality of it?
Okay.
Now, I'd ask those 4 questions in a survey that I was sending out. If I was just talking to you on the phone like we are today, then I might only ask you 2 of those. So, hey, we talked about this product. You like this feature, that other feature, which is great. At what point is this, way too expensive? You're not going to return my call. And then you'll give me an answer. You'll stumble through it a bit. You'll give me some more context. And then I'll ask, at what point is this a really good deal? Like, you'd sign up today. And then you give me an answer, you'd stumble through, you give me context. And now all of a sudden I have a range. And if I do that across, 30 people, 100 people, 150 people, depending on the gravity of the decision you're trying to make, then I can start to pinpoint, based on the segment of customer that you're in, or all the segments that you're looking at, what the willingness to pay looks like and where I should peg that. And there's some fancier analysis you can do with that type of data to get what's called an elasticity curve, which will basically help you measure, if you change your price, what's going to be the relative, impact on your bottom line.
Makes sense. How do you raise and update the pricing? I mean, first in terms of how much, and then how often, or making it more complex? As Intercom, I have seen their pricing is becoming more and more complex, or maybe introducing new variable in pricing. How to think around that?
So I think that, so there's two things there. There's complexity, and then there's also, the concept around, how often you should change your pricing.
Right.
So in terms of complexity, I think that a lot of people conflate complexity with conversion. Oh, if I'm going to have a higher, complexity, all of a sudden I'm going to have lower conversion. And the correlation isn't as strong as you would think. But that does mean you have to have proper design on how you approach a customer. So what I mean by that is when you look at Intercom has spent an exceptional amount of time on the user experience of the design of the site.
Right.
Now, that might mean that they're still having problems. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. But because they have these multiple products and because they have all this other fun stuff, what ends up happening is it gets complex in terms of execution. Now, what they're able to do, though, with that complexity is they can get you on one product and they can expand you to another product and so on and so forth. And what's really powerful about that is that helps them with their expansion revenue and all of that other kind of fun stuff. Right. Now, they could make it simpler, but then they lose those expansion opportunities. And so it's a really, really big balance between where do you get that customer to get inside your product as a customer, and then what do you do after that to kind of scale that particular experience. And so sometimes that's an easy thing, right? So if I have like a mobile app, I'm probably going to show them one plan to get on board. And then based on their usage, I'm going to show them another plan, or I'm going to use a value metric to kind of get them to expand. If you're a B2B sales product that, sells to the enterprise, you're probably going to have multiple conversations with your prospect before they convert. And so you can kind of explain away a lot of the complexity. And so I think overall, it's one of those things where that complexity is not always a bad thing. The other thing I would say, and the other part of the question was essentially how often you should change your pricing. Right. You really, if you are a company, if you're in the early stage, or even if you're a company that has a really good, just a really good product team, you should probably be changing your pricing once every 6 months. And the reason for this is that your price is the exchange rate on the value that you're providing. And so because of that exchange rate is going to change when you're adding more value, either adding more features, getting more brand, getting more clout, all of those different things. Right. And so that's where you need to basically change your price in correlation with your product improving. Now, the other reason that you should change it is because you're probably not really good at pricing right now, the folks listening, because you don't focus on it. It's important, but it's not something where you're like, oh, I'm going to run some ads. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to learn really, really quickly. Pricing's at the center of your business. And so there's a lot of anxiety around what you should change. And so what I end up doing a lot of the times is, recommending to people to start really small. But there's so much that you can fix with your monetization, your discount rate for annuals, your packaging, your positioning, right. Your add-on structure, like all of these different things. There's always going to be something, and it might not necessarily be the core price that you're charging or the core packaging within your tiers, but there's always going to be something that you should be adjusting. And so with that, that's why I recommend starting small, but making sure that you're basically, treating pricing as the growth lever that it deserves to be treated as.
Right. What do we do with old customers with old pricing if we are, let's say, changing the pricing every 6 months? What should or what should not be done with these old customers with old pricing?
So with old customers, I don't recommend doing grandfathering. So grandfathering is when you basically say, hey, old customers, you're always going to have your price. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Okay. The first reason, and there's a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, everyone wants to grandfather their customers, and there's no business sense in doing it. Now, the first reason is because, and it's very mathematical, it's very easy to grandfather your customers until the $10 million mark. Once you reach the $10 million mark, it's very, very difficult to get to $100 million or even $50 million without raising your prices somewhat on the existing customers that you already have. Because from 0 to 10 million, depending on your space, most of your growth is going to come from, acquiring more customers, getting more market share. Right. But for most of us, like once you get after 10 million, like the market share, it's not that it's not there anymore and you can't acquire more customers. It's just that that rate of growth is going to change and you need to expand the ARPU of your customers in order to maintain very, very high growth rates. The other reason is that you're training your customers to expect more for less, because presumably you're going to continue to add to the product constantly. Right. And when you're doing that, all of a sudden you need to make sure that you're focused on essentially not kind of training those customers that they're just going to keep getting more. And to do that, you shift your pricing. Now, there's a lot of things you can do to soften any price actual increase or any pricing change. One thing in particular that you can do is you can do what's called a grandfather discount. So basically taking your particular customer and saying, hey, you've been so loyal. Thank you so much. We appreciate you so much. We've made so many changes to the product. We made so many changes to help you be better, all that kind of fun stuff. And then all of a sudden, that means that we're going to give you 12 months at the current price. And then the price will go up to the new price. And the price is going to go up for everyone new, but you're getting this 12-month discount essentially. And that helps people because people understand that things cost money. And a lot of times when we're grandfathering or we're increasing prices, we're always scared. It's like, oh no, they're going to churn or something like that. So long story short, I think that, and the few exceptions, just to round out that point, if your market is huge, like you're a help desk, you're a chat product or something like that, you shouldn't grandfather, but you can, and you can still be fine.
Makes sense. Patrick, what are your views on you mentioned this earlier also, on one-time fee or some sort of add-on things or services apart from your subscription revenue from the same customers? What are the pros and cons, or is there a right way to do this? So one very common example is obviously companies charging one-time onboarding fee from bigger clients. So is it something small startups should think of, or is it something to think of very later in the stages?
Yeah, definitely. I think that for most companies, they turn their noses up at any professional fees or one-time fees. And I think the problem is that one-time implementation fees or training fees actually improve retention and then also lower your CAC pretty considerably, because that cash can go to your CAC. Right. And so I'm a pretty big fan of, depending on your product, but both B2B and B2C having some sort of implementation or setup fee actually doesn't impact conversion that much. But it does, impact, those other important metrics. And so it's something interesting to kind of keep in mind. From a professional services standpoint, I think that a lot of people miss out on some big opportunities to basically get paid to do their customer development. Normally, someone who basically has a need and is willing to pay you for it, you can productize whatever that need is or whatever that solution is over time. Now, you need to think through it, because there are some types of professional services or one-time fees that are going to be too expensive or just not worth it or things like that. But right. It's just something to kind of think about. I think overall it's a missed opportunity for most companies, because they get kind of, I don't know what the right word is, they get stuck up about, it has to all be the recurring revenue. And some professional services can also be recurring, which is also really interesting.
Interesting. So I was talking to a B2B SaaS startup founder. So what they were doing is they were using that initial onboarding fee as a leverage point that, okay, we'll discount this whole fee and as a tactic for sales. Would you advise doing such a thing or not? So they were willingly.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay. I
think that it's a great lever, right? Because if you have a one-time fee of, let's say, $1,000, and then you have a $100, monthly fee, I don't want to touch the monthly fee. I don't want to touch that at all, because that's my recurring revenue, and over time, that's going to compound to be, valuable, right?
Right.
Now that one-time fee, I'm happy to discount that, because that's not affecting the revenue that's super important to me. So yeah, it's a good lever that you can use as like a carrot, if you will, as we say in the States, in order to, basically, get that customer across the line, especially if there's a discount expectations in the industry that you're in, which, B2B and things like that, sometimes there's that expectation.
Right. Okay, Patrick, let's move to another important topic, which is pricing pages. So how to actually design an excellent pricing page in terms of overall strategy and then also structure, copy, UI elements, etc. for the pricing page. Any key learnings or tactics from all the pricing page tear downs that you've been doing for so many companies?
Yeah, totally. So the big thing to keep in mind here is I am definitely not a designer.
Okay.
I don't play one on TV. I don't. It's not my expertise, and so it is one of those things to kind of think about just in terms of my advice here. So most of my advice is probably going to be around experience and kind of what we've seen work really well.
Right.
So I think in terms of experience, it goes back to that persona which we talked about a while ago, and you want to make sure that when a persona comes to your page, and let's say you're targeting 3 different types of people, small companies, big companies, and medium companies, and let's make it more specific, small sales teams, medium sales teams, large sales teams.
Right.
When that person comes to that page, there shouldn't be a lot of confusion around which page they should be going to, or which plan that they belong to. So you want to make sure the copy, the names of your pricing plans, all of those different things you want to make sure line up to basically those folks going to the right page or going to the right plan, I should say. In addition to that, you also want to make sure that your particular customers have very little confusion around what in God's name that they're purchasing. There's a lot of pricing pages that I go to and I'm just like, I have no idea what they're selling to me. I know it has a vague concept of X, Y, Z, but it's not something that I'm really, really super clear on. And so that's another thing to kind of think through. I don't think a lot of people do think through those types of things. And then around design, if you continue to add more complexity, you probably should just reduce that complexity and then have a sales process. If you can't do that, then you definitely need to rethink who you're targeting and what you're basically selling to them, because that complexity can obviously make it difficult. And that's where it comes back to that particular customer.
Right. About different plans and different buyer persona, how should founders think around, okay, what should be a self-serve entirely and in what places should we start and giving those leads to the sales team with a contact sales button? How should we think around this?
Yeah, I think this comes down to a lot of unit economic conversations. Okay. So understanding, so for example, if it's a $50 a month customer, it's hard to have a business unless you have just insane velocity of, customers coming in or prospects coming in. It's hard to imagine staffing that with a salesperson, even a very inexpensive salesperson. It's something that's really, really tough. And so normally what you want to find is where is that level through which you can basically set things up in order to properly have good unit economics when it comes to acquiring customers. Now, I think that depending on who you ask, that might be a $500 a month minimum. That could be $1,000 a month minimum. But in some cases, it comes down to $50 a month because there's a ton of leads coming through and your expectation might be to sell, 100 of those deals in a particular month. So it really comes down to the unit economics. And I think that if you're finding you can't sell something for $50 a month or less or a little bit more without a salesperson, and you don't have that velocity, then there's probably something wrong. And you should explore what's going on there.
Makes sense. Patrick, how should we localize the pricing? I mean, not just based on the currency conversions, which is of course an option, but also to reflect the purchasing power of the other currency. How to think around this?
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back to the personas and then collecting the right data. So when you have, and if you have more than 15% to 15 to 20% of your customer base or your prospect base coming to you from outside of your home region, you definitely should be localizing. That's a good proxy for it. And so with that, what we typically recommend doing is taking your your product, and depending on how kind of defined the market is, running price testing or price data collection in those different regions. So I would ask those pricing questions in the UK. I'd ask them in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and this is if I'm expanding more into Europe from the United States. But I also, if I have a big base in India or Southeast Asia, I'd ask questions there. And then what'll happen is you'll get data back around, do these particular price points and cost structures, do they make sense from the perspective of, of what you're trying to sell? And normally what'll end up happening, kind of short circuit some of the learnings, is like the Nordics and Western Europe will be willing to pay more than the United States. Southeast Asia will be willing to pay less. And then other countries are somewhere in between. But it's a lot of power there, because not only updating the currency symbol is super, super important, but you also have different just purchasing power, not only just from a cost of living perspective, but also from the perspective of like, hey, they don't have any CRMs in Brazil, or you're competing with a local software company versus, something like a Salesforce.
Right. Do you think it matters more in B2B SaaS startups than B2C? Because I've seen many B2B SaaS startups who kind of entirely operate in US dollars, their whole cash flow. So it doesn't make sense to localize or not localize. Do you think, what have you seen? Any examples of that?
Yeah, it's an enormously missed opportunity. So normally B2B companies, the problem is if something works in B2C from a pricing perspective, like a tactic, it typically will work in B2B because humans are purchasing both products, right? So it's like when dogs purchase products that might change, they might purchase B2C versus B2B differently, but like human beings, like we're the ones purchasing all of these products, right? And so normally what ends up happening is in B2B, like you're like, oh, the dollar, I'm just going to, convert in dollars because it's just a lot easier for me, the finance person at this US based company. But in reality, the way that people buy in India, or the way people buy in Poland, or the way people buy in Norway, all four of those places, including the United States, are very, very different in how they think. Right. And it's probably there's a comfort factor in a localized price, at least from a currency perspective. And then when it comes to the actual regional based or kind of market based pricing in each region, there's also just the element of the density of that particular market. So yeah, long story short, I think typically if something works in B2B, it's going to work in B2C. Now there's different things, like you don't typically have, high infrastructure and all that kind of fun stuff in certain places versus others. But normally the tactics are pretty shareable across the different types of businesses.
The reason I'm very curious on this topic is because I have a pet peeve against an awesome meditation app, which is called Simple Habit, which is a great product, but their pricing is very, very high, too high for a normal Indian users, I would say. So just because the low purchasing power of Indian currency against US dollars, Indian currency is like all-time low right now. So what would you suggest to such a startup? How should they think if they want to penetrate more into Indian markets? One example I could give you is, so Netflix, I think Netflix India is directly currency conversion. So whatever if $10 or $13 it costs India, so equivalent to that only it costs in India. But Amazon Prime Video, it's completely different. It's much, much, much cheaper here in India. It's something 999 rupees a year. So both strategies are different. Netflix just converted the currency rate, and Amazon Prime Video, they had a completely new pricing strategy. So what would you suggest a meditation app like Simple Habit? How should they do this?
Yeah, it's super interesting. So just to be clear, Amazon is 1,000 rupees a year. So like $14 a year.
Right.
$14.
Right.
Yeah. And then basically Netflix is like $10 US dollars to $13 US dollars a month. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's amazing, right? And Amazon is probably playing a nice volume game, right? So for Simple Habits, I mean,
Amazon is like crushing it here in India. In terms of
totally, because it's totally right, and that's an interesting structure, right? It's an interesting like strategy. I think another great example is Evernote. So Evernote absolutely crushed it with an internationalized pricing strategy. At least they were using it. I know they were pricing in, I think, like 100 different countries differently, which is pretty powerful.
Wow.
Yeah, and so and that was because someone in China or someone in India, there's just different purchasing power when it comes to the US dollar, right?
Right.
And it's not that like for example, that 1,000 rupees per year, it might feel very similar to the $100 per month, like meaning the way you feel 1,000 rupees might be very similar to how I feel, $100, right? Just because there's different purchasing power and there's just different inflation and all that other stuff. And so that's really what you're trying to get to. So for Simple Habits, I mean, they might actually be caught up because Apple and Google Play just don't give them enough flexibility when it comes to pricing on a country by country basis.
That's a good point.
Or it's really difficult to do that, and that's terrible, right? Because that's a huge missed opportunity for both Apple, Google Play, and Simple Habit, because they're all incented for Simple Habit to do better because Apple and Google Play are taking their cut.
Right, makes sense. What kind of experimentation, tests, and optimizations that we should be doing on overall pricing strategy as well as the pricing page in general? Any specific examples you could suggest?
Yeah, I think the thing to keep in mind is that it's probably not a good idea to A/B test your pricing or multivariate test your pricing. And the reason is because we normally have much less traffic than we need to do very clean tests. And so in that respect, I think it's something that's super, super important to do your research up front. Now, you're not going to necessarily know if you have a winner or a loser in terms of something until you put it out there. But normally, if you do your research methods up front, you're hedging your risk as much as possible. Now, there are companies out there like Amazon can do a price test in 30 seconds. They
Right.
just get so much traffic. But we're most of us aren't Amazon, right? And so it's one of those things to kind of think about. In the context of, kind of what's moving, particularly for, your company, I think you need to kind of do that research cycle. And the research also helps with everything else in your business. Now, from a price perspective, like what are some of the things that you commonly do see testing? Sometimes the user experience of the page, we talked a lot about that.
Right.
Other things like the rate through which you do a annual discount. The messaging is something you typically test. Just because different messaging pieces, you can definitely collect research on that, but that's something that you can reasonably then test within your business as well.
Any specific examples that we could try on the overall pricing strategy? Means playing around the different variables of pricing. Let's say one day I try out that there would be unlimited sales rep for XYZ product, but then I thought, okay, no, it would more sense, let's say, if some other value metric that we are seeing is making more sense. And how do you think around that?
Which aspect? Tell me a little bit more.
Okay.
I'm not sure I understand the
I'm
question.
not sure if I remember it correctly. If we see intercom and drift, so I think in intercom there is a thing in their pricing in which they have unlimited reps that can access to each plan. But in drift, we see there is a pricing axis of how many reps are there in their system. So they're both product and their whole vendor, they are similar kind of vendor. So how could they have reached to different type of strategy?
Yeah. So normally Intercom up until recently was not a sales driven product, meaning it wasn't a product for salespeople.
Right.
Drift started off very clearly for salespeople, right? They had some kind of dissonance and some differences here and there, but that was kind of the structure. And so when it comes to, looking at Drift and Intercom, I think that Drift is very, hey, we're going to sell like salespeople buy, and we're going to kind of focus on that per seat. Because we are strictly a sales product, whereas Intercom is still fighting a little bit of this battle internally, whether they should kind of specialize in particular that effect, or if they should focus in on trying to be everything to all people. So trying to not only get salespeople, but also support people and, kind of everything in between. And so they've both been somewhat successful. I'm not sure what's going to happen in terms of the future, of course, but it is one of those things where you can have different pricing tiers and plans for different types of companies going after the same market.
Makes sense. Patrick, have you heard of this product by Heaton Shah, Use FYI?
I know Heaton very, very well. So yes,
Okay. So I was just looking at their pricing. So their main core value proposition is search and organize all your document. So I was thinking on, okay, if I'm trying to optimize or do experimentation around their pricing page. So right now it's simply $8 per user per month. But later we found out, okay, the value metric is number of searches that people are doing. So how do you think around this?
Yeah, totally. So I got to be careful because I helped Heaton and Marie with the
Okay. It's okay
with
if
their
you
pricing.
don't want to
and
discuss
so-
that. If you don't want to discuss that,
No,
it's
no,
okay.
they were pretty public about it. So
Okay.
I think yeah. So I think, I mean, I like this pricing style of page, mainly because I think that the structure, the way that they've kind of set it up, has been, set up to have that value metric around search activity. And I think that's pretty powerful just because it's one of those things where, someone can, just keep using their product. And then all of a sudden when they, run into a roadblock in terms of, hey, what's going on with, the business, or what's going on with this particular thing that I'm thinking about, it's like, oh, okay. And I just kind of click through and basically get to get to a paid plan, if that makes sense. So
Right.
yeah, it's one of those things that's it's a pretty important piece of the overall business.
Cool. You mentioned this earlier also. What about brand? So suppose a startup is able to create a good brand in their category, then how to think around the markup in the pricing that would be attributed to the brand? How do you reflect brand in your pricing?
Yeah, I mean, brand's huge. I think it's one of those things where we used to think brand was like reserved for retail products or things like that. But
Right.
brand is something that affects us all now because, features and functionality are not as interesting anymore. I mean, they're interesting, but they're not as revolutionary as they once were. And so when it comes to brand, you need to have some sort of a brand strategy. Like, it shouldn't necessarily be super complicated, but it should be something where you're kind of focusing on how do we come at the positioning of our company and our product in the right direction. So yeah, long story short, I think brand is super important. And I think that it's one of those things you have to think about.
Cool. Okay. So, Patrick, all this discussion we had has been super useful and tactical. But let's take another scenario. The things that we discussed, team of founder did not do any of it. So they're still growing and all. So my question is, what should be the action plan now? What to look on, how to identify and diagnose which stuff on pricing. So I saw you guys provide a service of free pricing audit also to companies. Maybe you could give a glimpse on what you do in that.
Yeah, definitely. So, founders, we typically, depending on if they're able to hook up to ProfitWell, we can do a pretty extensive audit, which is like a benchmarking comparison of basically what's happening in the market compared to them. If they aren't able to do that, we're still able to provide value, but basically a pricing audit. In the free pricing audit, we basically just ask you a bunch of questions and then, say, hey, here's where we would start. Here's the first thing that you should focus on based on the expected value of that. And then that helps in particular because, most of the time we as like operators, we want to know where we should start. And then we have a bunch of resources that we give so that someone can do that on their own. And of course, if, they want help or they want to hire us or use our software, we're always more than happy to have that conversation. But yeah, free pricing audits, happy to give anyone. And we do this for, there's plenty of people that we know are not going to end up paying us that we do it for just because we want to give back to the community. So yeah, not something you got to worry about in terms of that structure.
So Patrick, could you explain more about ProfitWell as what are the features and the value metric and your own pricing? Because how did you reach on that? I saw your pricing page. It's first of all very quietly, very well done. And it seems very interesting. You start with 0 and then all the value metrics. So could you explain that? How did you reach that? And what was the process like?
Yeah, essentially we collected data on the metrics product. We originally were going to sell the metrics product and the data came back and it was very not good. It's hard to sell in the metrics and BI space because the expectations are so high and the willingness to pay is relatively pretty low. And so we were either going to kill the product or there's a larger vision around using the data to help people, in their businesses. And so actually making BI actually intelligent. And so that's kind of what we started marching against. And that means that ProfitWell needs to be free. And so ProfitWell is not only your engagement and usage metrics, it's also your financial metrics and soon to be your attribution metrics. And there'll be some benchmarking in there, and it's going to remain free because it's we want to be the best product on the market and give that product away. And then we make money when we make you money. So with Retain, you only make it's an add-on that you add to your ProfitWell account, and we automatically lower your churn by attacking with some AI and just a ton of metadata, your delinquent credit cards and things like that. So yeah, long story short, I think that's kind of where our focus is, and it's one of those things where we ran our playbook very cleanly around what we needed to do in terms of making our customers get the most value and capturing our side of that value.
Cool. So Patrick, that was pretty much it. Any final advice you would give to founders related to pricing? Any big mistakes that you see startups doing very often, or something you think startups need to do more of?
Yeah, it's a process. I mean, pricing's a process. I think a lot of people, they want some magic bullet, and they want magic bullets for all of the parts of their business. But at the end of the day, it's a process that takes effort. And it's not that hard. It's not extremely difficult. If you're smart enough to start a company, you're smart enough to work on your pricing. And so I would just kind of, work on that process, and then ultimately, start with something small. If you haven't really done this before, start with a smaller problem and then go after it. And if you have any questions, my email address is pc@profitwell.com. More than happy to help and more than happy to answer any questions.
Cool. You active on Twitter and LinkedIn also?
Yep, I am. I am Patticus, Patticus on Twitter, and then just Patrick Campbell on LinkedIn, and I'm pretty active on both.
Cool. Any final resource you'll suggest to listeners apart from your own awesome blog and YouTube channel? I would myself suggest.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest going to, especially when it comes to pricing. We wrote a lot. There's not a lot written out there, and we take a pretty clean approach to making it very framework driven and very focused. So yeah, that's what I would focus on.
Makes sense. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for all the insights. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the time, and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye now.
That's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes would be available in the link below, or you can just go to insightsalley.com/notes. Please rate, review, subscribe in whichever app you are listening to this episode. And most importantly, give feedback in comments, reviews, or you can just email me at arun@insightsalley.com. You can also follow and connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, etc. My handle everywhere is ARUN11192. And remember, always be learning. Bye.